This video is sponsored by VoxLink.
VoxLink is the ultimate tabletop gaming community app. With the Game Finder, you can easily find new opponents to have unforgettable game nights with. No more posting on awful social media pages and screaming into the void. VoxLink connects you to nearby players playing your games, tournaments, and events across your community.
Hey Wargamers, you know, there are a few things that massively influence your final score in a game that occur before you even move a model. One of those things is your army list, which is, of course, is super important. Another really important thing is your deployment, but also critical is your selection of secondary mission objectives, right? Secondary missions are half of your scoring points, and so you need to be able to get those points, right? You need to be able to select secondaries that work for you in your army on that tabletop against your particular opponent. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today is secondary mission selection, especially for Tau Empire in the Arks of Omen Grand Tournament Pack. Now, every time GW releases one of these chapter approves, they tweak the way secondaries work, or they tweak the formulation of the secondaries, things like that. This time around, we have a couple changes. One is that you can pick up to 3 faction secondaries, right? You don't have to just take one. You can take, basically as many as you want. But the flip side of that is that they've pared down the secondaries too. They've streamlined the secondaries, making your choices simplified, which is appreciated, and removing some of the imbalance between codices in terms of the total number of secondaries and things like that. So it's a little bit simpler to choose your secondaries in Arks of Omen, which is nice. For Tau, we don't have a lot of choice though. Tau are essentially restricted to 3 different categories, and that's because we lack psychers, right? We don't have any way of performing psychic actions or really doing psychic phase scoring, and so that really puts us into 3 different categories: board control, objective control, and kill points. Now, board control and objective control are the battlefield supremacy and shadow operations groupings of secondaries, and then we have kill points, right? So the board control, objective control, secondaries, those are things that we're going to take, and then everything else just falls into this kill point category, which does include the Warpcraft secondary aboard the Witch, but that's just killing psychers, right? So it's not really anything notable. No Mercy, No Respite, Purge enemy, those are the other 2 groups of secondaries that we can throw into this kill point group. And so those are the categories that we're going to be picking from. We're always going to want board control. We're always going to want some objective control secondary, and then it's just a matter of picking which kill point secondary really fits for that particular game. Now, when we're selecting those secondaries, we really want to be thinking about which ones we can reliably score at least 10 points each game, right? If we're getting fewer than 10 points, it's probably not going to be enough. We want to have at least 10 points in each of those categories in order to keep our final score potential high, right? If we pick secondaries where we think we're only going to get a few points, we are shooting ourselves in the foot and prematurely limiting our final score, right? So picking ones that score at least 10 points is really kind of a bare minimum, and we want to be able to do that reliably, meaning that we can score them, generally independent of how we're doing in the primary, right? So even if we're behind in the primary, even if we're getting, dominated in one way, we want to pick secondaries that provide us an option to claw our way back, right? Something that we can make some smart plays and pull off, even if things aren't otherwise going our way. And that avoids a problem that we often run into with secondaries, which are the win harder secondaries. Win harder secondaries are objectives that you really only are getting if you're winning the game anyway, right? If you're just totally, kicking butt, you're going to get those. And that's not really useful, right? That doesn't determine the game. That's just reinforcing an already existing game state. What we want are secondaries that can tip the scales in the case of a tight game. Those are the things that are really going to matter. If it's something that you're already winning and you just win more, like that doesn't make a difference for the game, right? So we really want those ones that are going to be the tiebreaker. Those are the ones that are going to be the most useful for us in general. If we are picking unreliable secondaries, ones that aren't going to be those tiebreaker secondaries or aren't going to be high scoring, we are putting ourselves in a position where we're more likely to not win the game, right? Because we're opening the door for all sorts of disadvantageous scenarios to arise. So let's go through the different secondaries, talk about their strengths or weaknesses, how you might be able to achieve them, and under which conditions you might want to select them. All right, so let's start off with Battlefield Supremacy here. We'll go through and make sure everyone's on the same page about what the secondaries are, and then talk about them after we've covered what they are in each section. And so, if you have the GT pack, you can follow along. Otherwise, here they are, right? So the first one is Decisive Action. This is the Tau-specific Battlefield Supremacy secondary. It says, if you selected Mon Ka at the start of the battle, then at the end of your turn in battle rounds 1, 2, and 3, score 4 victory points if you control half or more of the total number of objective markers on the battlefield. And then it's the same thing for Cao Yun, except for it's in rounds 3, 4, and 5. Behind enemy lines, this is the kind of default secondary that you are assigned and then deviate from based on the rules. It says, score 3 victory points at the end of your turn if one unit from your army, excluding aircraft, is wholly within your opponent's deployment zone. Score 4 at the end of your turn, instead, if 2 or more units from your army, excluding aircraft, are wholly within your opponent's deployment zone. In addition, if one or more of those units is a troops, or an Armiger class or a War Dog class, you gain 1 command point at the end of the current battle round. And the final Battlefield Supremacy secondary is Engage on All Fronts. Score 2 victory points at the end of your turn if you have 1 or more qualifying units from your army wholly within 3 different table quarters, and those units are all more than 6 inches away from any other table quarter. Score 3 victory points instead if you have 1 or more qualifying units from your army wholly within each table quarter, and those units are all more than 3 inches away from any other table quarter. Qualifying unit is one that has a starting strength of 3 or more models, or one that contains 1 or more vehicle or monster model, excluding aircraft. Note that's starting strength, right? It's not present strength. Okay, so what are the relative strengths of these different secondary options? Well, Decisive Action is just a banger of a secondary, right? It only requires 2 or 3 objectives to score 4 points each turn, which means that it's very achievable, especially if you select Cao Yun, right? For Cao Yun, that's happening on the second half of the game where the board is less cluttered. It allows you a little bit more opportunity to grab those objectives, and importantly can be prioritized even if there is a disadvantaged board state, right? Even if your opponent is, in your deployment zone, getting in your way, you can grab those objectives with some clever maneuvering, right? So it's something that you can do in many different types of environments. It's something you can do with Mon Ka as well, right? Mon Ka having this scored on turns 1, 2, and 3 is possible, especially because you will have at least 1 objective in your deployment zone, so it's not that hard to grab a couple more. But for Mon Ka, you have to be careful because you don't want to be pushing yourself, overextending yourself in a way that's going to leave your units vulnerable or unsupported. And so with Mon Ka, as always, the idea is to be calculating in how you are deploying and how you are grabbing objectives. It's going to be a lot easier in like a 6 objective mission generally, because you're more likely to be able to grab some closer objectives and not necessarily have to travel as far or overextend yourself in Mon Ka. Behind enemy lines, I think is certainly the weakest of these 3 for most Tau players. It's often going to be a distraction from the primary, right? Focusing on trying to get into the enemy deployment zone. That's something that works really well if you want to be there, but Tau generally don't, right? Tau generally want to be a little bit further away. We're more of a mid-range army at best right now, and so we don't want to really be in their deployment zone. So, if you're in the deployment zone, you're probably not doing the other things that you need to do to win the game. And so it can fit with Mod Ka, but again, it's a really easy way to become overwhelmed. If you're having, some of your units charge up the board to get in the enemy deployment zone, you're probably putting them in a place where they're going to get charged, they're going to get overwhelmed with volume of fire or something like that. There are options, of course. Things like Cruise or Deep Striking Vespid can get there without necessarily putting themselves in quite as big of a disadvantageous situation, although they'll probably be there and then gone the next turn, but they could be there to score the objective. They could do things like collect data there as well. So if you're doing collect battlefield data, that's some way that you can get some value out of those maneuverings. But by late game, you probably are going to have relatively few units. And you are going to need those units for objective control for your primary, right? And so we get into a situation late game with behind enemy lines where you are probably in a place where if you have enough units to be scoring this, you probably have already, pretty handedly won the game. And so I think this falls into the win harder category, right? Where by late game, if you have enough units that you're just throwing them into the enemy deployment zone, that you're probably sitting pretty at that point. Engage on all fronts. This is table quarters, right? But you have to be positioned just so in order to score this, right? And that can be a little challenging, right? You have to be thoughtful in your positioning, which, understatement, of course, for the game as a whole, but you have to be positioned just so, and you can only score one table quarter with a unit, right? So you can't have like one unit scoring multiple table quarters or anything like that, based on the restrictions of the objective. So that makes this a little bit more finicky than things like decisive action, right? And decisive action too is going to be allowing you to score that while you're also focusing on primary. So there's some synergy there. There's some congruence there between decisive action and the primary that you don't quite have with engage on all fronts. Engage on all fronts might distract you from the primary. But if you feel like you're in a position where you're just not going to be able to compete on primary, then maybe engage in all fronts is for you, right? Maybe this is your backup plan if primary is really going to be challenging for you. And so that's kind of the band of conditions where engage in all fronts is going to be preferable. But in general, I think decisive action is the more reliable choice for most scenarios, right? And that's kind of rare, right? That often secondaries are going to be highly context dependent, but I think for Battlefield Supremacy, decisive action is going to be your go-to that you're going to want to consider most of the time. All right, moving on to Shadow Operations. The town-specific one here is Aerospace Targeting Relays. If you choose this secondary, you put a marker halfway along each table edge, right? So there's 4 of them. And infantry units in your Tau Empire army can perform an action that is install targeting relays. For this one or more Tau Empire infantry units from your army can start to perform this action at the end of your movement phase, right? And so 2 important notes there. One is it can be 1 or more, so you can score it multiple times in a turn, and it's at the end of your movement phase. Each unit from your army that starts to perform this action must be within 6 inches of a different aerospace designation marker that has not had a targeting relay installed at it by your army. If a Fire Warrior team, so strikes, breachers, pathfinders, is performing this action, it is completed at the end of your turn. Otherwise, it is completed at the start of your next command phase or at the end of the battle, whichever comes first. Right? So if you're doing a Fire Warrior team, it happens pretty fast. If you are doing anything else, though, you have to wait all the way until your next command phase. If completed, that aerospace designation marker is said to have a targeting relay installed at it by your army. At the end of battle, score a number of victory points based on how many targeting relays were installed. If you score 1, you get 2, 2, you get 6, 3, you get 9, and 4, you get 15, right? So you max out at 4. So really, we're aiming to get 4 here. But again, you can do that all in one turn if you were positioned correctly. Then we have Raise the Banners High. If you select this objective, units in your army can perform Raise the Banners action. So one or more infantry units from your army can start to perform this action at the end of your movement phase. Each unit in your army that starts to perform this action must be within range of a different objective marker you control, and that does not have one of your banners raised on it. The action is completed at the end of your turn. If completed, the objective marker is said to have one of your army's banners on it. You score 1 victory point at the end of each of your command phases, and 1 victory point at the end of the battle for each objective marker on the battlefield that has one of your banners on it. And the last Shadow Operations is Retrieve Battlefield Data. They gave up the convention of the season name and everything like that. Now it's just Retrieve Battlefield Data, which I actually much prefer. If you select this objective, keep a Retrieve Data tally. In addition, units from your army can attempt the following action. Retrieve data. 1 infantry or biker unit, so not multiple. That's different here, right? So it's just 1. 1 infantry or biker unit from your army can start to perform this action at the end of your movement phase if it is wholly within a table quarter that has not had a serval skull retrieved by your army and is more than 6 inches away from any other table quarter. This action is completed at the end of your turn, provided the unit performing it is still within the same table quarter. If completed, roll 1d6, subtracting 1 from the result if the unit that completed this action has a troops battlefield roll. If the result is less than or equal to the number of models currently in that unit, that table quarter is said to have a serval skull retrieved by your army, and you add 1 to your retrieved data tally. At the end of the battle, score 4 if your retrieved tally is 2, score 8 if your tally is 3, score 12 if your tally is 4, right? And so that's the maximum you can get is 12 on this one. And you can complete this really reliably with either troops units that have at least 5 models or non-troops units that have at least 6 models. All right, so how do these secondaries shake out? Well, for aerospace targeting, realize this is going to be something that you're going to have pretty easy turn 1, turn 2 scoring depending on how aggressive your opponent is, right? You can position on at least a couple different table edges to get these installed, and then late game you can move out to get those other ones if you can maintain board control or at least have a presence to grab those other table edges. So it works out fairly well in many different scenarios, but particularly if you have Fish of Fury, right? So Fish of Fury is an army list build that uses multiple Devilfish, multiple Fire Warrior teams. That type of setup is going to work out very well for scoring this objective. But you have other options as well if you're working outside the Fish of Fury archetype, but they take longer to score, right? So the big thing about Fire Warriors, right, is that the action completes at the end of your turn. If you're using non-Fire Warrior teams, then you have to wait until your next command phase in order to actually score it. And that's a challenge, right? That's a pretty big drawback because you are losing those units for the duration of that action being performed. So stealth suits, they can do this. You can deploy them on the table edge, basically, if you wanted to. But that is a somewhat risky move because of charges, right? One of the big risks in stealth suits deploying forward is that they provide an option for an opponent to potentially slingshot their melee units at your army, right? If they charge, you're giving them extra movement, and stealth suits aren't going to, put up much of a fight against a specialized melee unit. So that's a liability. There's something you have to consider when selecting this objective if you are bringing stealth suits. One potential solution to that, though, is if you also bring ghost kills, right? If you bring a ghost kill, you can do wall of mirrors and move guys around and stuff like that. And so the ghost kill might be kind of a secret play here if you're building your list specifically to do aerospace with stealth suits. Crisis suits can also do this because they're infantry, but you're giving up so much firepower to have crisis suits do this. So it's kind of one of those things where, if you're at the end of the game and your crisis suits are still kicking around, you don't have other options, go for it, right? The name of the game is to score points. So maybe this is one of the things that you do that, but that wouldn't be my priority, right? I wouldn't build the list thinking my crisis suits are going to do this. Vespid also can do this, right? But Vespid generally are pretty squishy, right? So So they can do it, and it might work out, like, again, it's kind of a one-off thing, but I would either, if I was planning on Vespid doing this, I would have to bring multiple units of Vespid, or have some other backup plan, right? And so really, this is one of those things where we want our Fire Warriors to be doing it, but we can pull out other tricks if the opportunity presents itself, or we really want to dedicate a list around that strategy. Raise the banners high. That's a pretty reliable way to get more than 10 points if you can control at least 2 objectives, or about 2 objectives on average throughout the whole game, right? If you're controlling 2 objectives throughout the game, you're going to be getting 10 points from those progressive points, and then you would get another couple points just from having those, right? So you're going to be able to score this if you're able to hold on to those objectives. And so it's going to be something that's going to be a lot more feasible in like a 6 objective mission, or one where you have a lot of scoring advantage and are going to be able to push people off objectives, keep them from pulling your banners down, basically. But in 4 objective missions, it's going to be a lot harder because, of course, your opponent is going to be really focused on every single objective, right? There's not going to be any low priority objectives, and so that's going to be a much tighter match. So those 6 objective missions are going to be ones where this is a lot more feasible. Retrieve battlefield data. It's a good pick if the other 2 aren't favorable, right? So if you're looking at aerospace, you say, I can't really do that. Looking at areas of banners, saying there's too much pressure, go with retrieve battlefield data. And there's a bunch of ways that you can do this. And it is one of those ways that Vespid are still viable. Vespid are much better for retrieve battlefield data than they are aerospace targeting, because they can drop down, perform the action, and be good. And you can take, a unit of, 6 of them, and you're guaranteed to get the battlefield data retrieved. So retrieve battlefield data is a good standby if neither aerospace targeting or raise the banners seem like good choices. In the case of, really mobile, really aggressive opponent for aerospace, or just not having really the opportunity to grab objectives for raise the banners, right? And so for Shadow Operations and Battlefield Supremacy, I have kind of a baseline framework that I start at and then modify depending on the table or the opponent. So for Battlefield Supremacy, I'm almost always going to take decisive action. It's a reliable choice, right? Then for Shadow Operations, my baseline generally is going to be retrieve battlefield data, right? I can often achieve that. But if I'm bringing Fish of Fury, if I'm bringing a lot of Fire Warriors, then I'll go aerospace as my default. I can switch, of course, right? That's not something I have to pick, before the game, and you really shouldn't pick before the game. You should, evaluate each game as it comes. But those are kind of the things that I'm thinking of as my standard, and then modifying from there. And then, of course, I'm going to pick one of the kill point secondaries, which is going to be totally opponent dependent, right? There's no way for me to have a baseline for those, because they all are so tailored to the particular type of opponent that I'm playing against. All right, so we'll start talking about these kill point secondaries. First with Purge the Enemy and Warpcraft, we'll go over those, and then we'll do No Mercy, No Respite after that. So Purge the Enemy, the default one is Assassination. Basically, there's a progressive component that if you kill a character with a troops unit or an armiger or war dog class, you gain a command point. But then the endgame component, the thing that actually scores you points, is you score 3 victory points for each enemy character unit that's destroyed, and 1 additional victory point if a warlord is destroyed. Then we bring it down. At the end of the battle, score victory points for each monster vehicle that was destroyed. You score 1 victory point if it had wounds of 9 or less, 2 if it had 10 to 14 wounds, 3 victory points if it had 15 to 19 wounds, or 4 victory points if it had 20 or more wounds. Right, and then aboard the Witch, the only Warpcraft one that Tau can score. You can't select this if you have a Psyker in your army, but that's not a problem for us. Score 3 victory points at the end of the battle for each Psyker character that was destroyed, and 2 for enemy Psyker units that are destroyed, right? So like Brotherhood of Psykers count for this. Easy way to get 2 victory points for every unit that you kill, that sort of thing. Okay, so how do these first 3 shake out? Well, Assassination is appealing because you're probably going to be trying to kill characters anyway, right? Like they're kind of anchor units in the army, and so you generally want to get rid of them. But many or maybe even most armies are only going to have a few characters, right? And that means that those characters are going to be highly protected and make it a lot harder for you to actually remove them. So it's possible to score more than 10 points for a lot of different armies, but it's often really risky, right? Like you're just not going to get the reliable points out of this in a lot of different scenarios. The case where that's not true is if they just have tons of characters, right? If they have lots of characters on the list, it's going to be a lot harder for them to protect those characters. And so you're going to have cracks in that protection, right? There's going to be opportunities for you to get those characters out of there. And of course, things like the Cold Star is going to be great at doing that, especially if you give it a few fusion blasters. You can zip up there and pew pew, get rid of a character. Sun Sharks, they're going to have some capacity to do this as well, or units in reserve, right? Either outflanking or deep striking or whatever. There are going to be options for doing this, but really, you're only going to want to pick it if you're playing against an army that has a lot of characters in it. At least 5 characters, if not more. Bring It Down, like Assassination, has built-in scoring against some lists. But you're looking at mechanized, monster, or knight lists that are going to be the ones that you're actually going to want to pick this against, right? If it only has 1 or 2 monsters, 1 or 2 vehicles, don't bother. But if the opponent has a ton of vehicles, like a ton of transports, then this is going to be one way that you can score points while you're doing your other stuff, right? Abhor the Witch, it's only worth it if every unit or nearly every unit in the opponent's list is a Psyker, right? Otherwise, you're just not going to have the kind of critical capacity to score with it. You're not going to have the opportunity to score with it. So things like Thousand Suns, Grey Knights, those are the types of lists where Abhor the Witch is a really clear choice. All right, and then No Mercy, No Respite. A clean victory. This is the final Tau-specific secondary. It says basically you score 1 victory point at the end of each battle round if you killed a unit using a Tau Empire unit, and you score 3 victory points if you destroyed 3 or more units using Tau Empire units, right? But if you selected Mon Ka, you can only score this in the first half of the game. If you selected Cao Yun, you can score it in the second half of the game. Grind Them Down. At the end of the battle round, you score 3 victory points if you destroyed more enemy units than friendly units were destroyed, and you gain a CP if you destroyed at least 1 enemy unit using troops, Armiger class, or War Dog class units. For no prisoners, you keep a tally of the number of wounds of destroyed models in your opponent's list, excluding vehicles, monsters, or characters. And then at the end of the game, you divide that total by 10. That's the number of victory points you get. But if your value is between 50 and 99, you get another victory point. Or if it's more than 100, you get an additional 2 victory points. All right, so for No Mercy, No Respite, a clean victory is as bad as decisive action is good. And that's mostly because it's limited in the number of turns you can score it by Cao Yun or Mon Ka. If that wasn't the case, I think this would be much more appealing. Basically, you have a maximum of victory points that you can get, and to do that, you would have to kill 3 units in each of those 3 turns. So that's pretty rough, right? Like that's a lot of units you have to remove in a very specific and short amount of time, and so you're just not going to get that really reliably. And so it's easy to get a few victory points here or there, right? Like you're going to kill stuff, but are you going to kill that number in that particular order? Probably not. It's way too restricting. And so this is one that I would basically never pick for that reason. It doesn't meet our goals that we set out at the beginning of this video, right? Grind Them Down. This is favorable against MSU units, right? Or MSU armies, right? Armies that have lots of small units that you can easily pick up. Crisis Suit builds, Fish of Fury builds can do well here due to the volume of fire that they can put out, right? You can kill multiple units potentially with each of those. Riptide builds can also do well here due to durability, right? So here you're concerned about how many units you kill versus how many units you lose. So Crisis, Fish of Fury, they're able to affect the top portion of that fraction, right? They're doing a lot of damage. They are potentially removing multiple units, making it easier for you to be on the winning side of that fraction. Riptides, on the other hand, maybe aren't going to be removing as many units, but they are going to be more durable and less likely to be removed themselves. So they're acting primarily by increasing, or rather decreasing, the number of units that you lose. And so this is a good choice if they have lots of different units that you can pick up. No prisoners, that's going to be something that you really only want to pick if the opponent has like 100 or more models, right? So like Genestealer cults, Orcs, Nids, assuming that's not monster based. Other horde type armies are going to be something that you pick up here. But those might be those types of lists, depending on the amount of characters that they have or the number of vehicles that they have. Maybe you want to be selecting different secondaries in those cases, right? If they have a lot of vehicles, maybe you want to go with Bring It Down. If they have lots of characters, maybe you want to go with Assassination. And so no prisoners is good, but again, you have to have the volume, right? And so one of the things with no prisoners is that unlike Grind Them Down, you're not worried about how many units you're losing, right? So if you're thinking about Grind It Down, but you're like, hey, they can remove my models just as easily as I can remove theirs, then maybe you think more about no prisoners, because you're not as worried about your defense, right? You're only concerned about your offense. So for the kill point secondaries, if the opponent has lots of monsters and vehicles, Bring It Down. If it has lots of characters, Assassination. If it has lots of small units and you don't grind them down. If they have lots of models, regardless of unit size, no prisoners. If they're Thousand Sons or Grey Knights, Abhor the Witch, right? Like, that's kind of the deal, right? And I don't know if you needed a video to really do that. It's like, I know it's the least interesting part of the video. I apologize, but it is what it is, right? Maybe the most valuable thing I can say is that a clean victory is a really hard sell compared to any of those other ones, right? That a clean victory just is not very clean, right? It's just hard to really get that to compete with the scoring potential of these other options. So yeah, that's it. I generally think about secondaries in this way. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Are there other things that you consider with choosing secondaries? What are your go-tos? Love to hear about it. Let's have a conversation. Thanks for watching, and as always, happy wargaming. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. We are probably in the final production run of the Invasive Wargaming model for the foreseeable future, so if you want to pick one of those up, head on over to Etsy and get them before they are gone. This video was made possible by my kind sponsor, so check out their link in the description below, as well as all the wonderful people over on Patreon. So if you liked this video, consider joining our community over there. Special thanks to Shifty, Durza, Everett Keller, Stephen Cowan, Jack and Acker, Jared Egler, and Scott Heater.